Opening the center's diagonals immediately, this pawn jump stakes a claim for central space and quick development, often leading to dynamic play. Instantly contesting the center, this reply sparks a lively struggle for central influence and opens avenues for rapid piece development. Developing a knight to challenge black's central pawn opens up aggressive possibilities while preparing for kingside castling. Developing the knight to its natural square reinforces the central pawn and prepares for active piece play. Developing the knight here aims to control central squares and prepare for d4, building a solid pawn structure. Threatening the e4 pawn, nf6 immediately challenges white's central pawn and activates black's knight towards the kingside. Pinning the knight creates immediate pressure, potentially disrupting black's pawn structure and piece harmony. Challenging white's central control, black immediately pins the knight, aiming to disrupt white's harmony. Securing the monarch opens up lines of attack and solidifies the king's safety. Securing the monarch is a prudent step, preparing to contest the central space and develop further forces without immediate kingly peril. Establishing a solid pawn structure, this advances white's central control and opens lines for pieces. Sacrificing the bishop for the knight here disrupts white's pawn structure, creating potential targets and opening diagonals for black's pieces. Opening a crucial b-file for rook pressure, but creating a doubled pawn weakness on the c-file. Solidifying the center with d6 strengthens black's pawn structure and prepares for potential king's side expansion. Pinning the knight aims to disrupt black's central pawn structure and create weaknesses on the king side. Protecting the e5 pawn while preparing to possibly challenge the open b-file offers flexibility. Repositioning the rook to the e-file creates an immediate threat of pressure against black's queen, preparing for potential central breakthroughs. Shifting the knight to d8 sacrifices pawn structure for potentially easier development and a reinforced kingside defense. Initiating a pawn confrontation to disrupt black's central influence and gain space. Recentralizing the knight after its detour clears the e-file and prepares to contest white's central pawn push, aiming for active piece play. Repositioning the bishop to c1 is a prudent step to consolidate the queenside pawn structure after the recent exchange, preparing for potential pawn pushes. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure aims to support a potential queenside expansion while reinforcing the knight's strong central post. Reclaiming the kingside bishop's influence, white strategically repositions to a more active diagonal, seeking to support an eventual central push. This knight's retreat to d7 aims to reroute, potentially supporting a central pawn push or reinforcing kingside defense. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure with g3 aims to create a safe haven for the monarch while preparing for future expansion on the queenside. Initiating a pawn confrontation in the center disrupts white's comfortable setup, aiming to open lines and challenge the king's security. Opening the d-file creates immediate tension, challenging black's pawn structure and potentially exposing the king. Reclaiming the pawn opens crucial diagonals and prepares for central pawn breaks, injecting life into black's position. A valiant knight ventures, seeking to pierce black's seemingly solid center, potentially exploiting weakened squares. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure, g6 aims to support the knight and prevent immediate kingside breakthroughs, creating a more robust defensive setup. Recapturing with the knight repositions it to a potentially more active square on the kingside. Seeking central control and preparing to push the c-pawn, the knight repositions to a more active square. Aimed at centralizing the knight, this repositioning prepares a potential kingside attack, bolstering white's attacking prospects. Preparing to contest the center and untangle the knights. Fortifying the king's safety and preparing for central pawn breaks are key objectives, but this squares away the bishop nicely too. Unlocking the dark-squared bishop's potential, black solidifies its pawn structure and prepares for a central engagement. Puncturing black's pawn chain with c4 aims to gain central space and pressure the d-pawn, potentially opening lines for white's pieces. Establishing a robust central pawn structure now becomes paramount for Black's operations, bolstering their midfield control. Prioritizing central control and piece coordination, this maneuver unifies White's queen with the developing army, aiming for dynamic potential. Exploring the d-file and preparing for central expansion, this knight subtly aims for a more active square. Sharpening the kingside attack, the bishop repositions to eye the center and potentially support a pawn push. This move fortifies the kingside structure, creating a more solid pawn chain and preparing to potentially advance the g-pawn. Initiating a pawn storm on the kingside, this push aims to shatter Black's defensive structure, potentially exposing the monarch. Reinforcing the central pawn tension and preparing for potential breakthroughs feels imperative now. Asserting control over the central files with this rook maneuver, White prepares to contest the d-file decisively. Exploring flank pawn advances to loosen White's central grip and potentially create queenside play. Asserting dominance over the d-file becomes paramount, preparing for potential advances and solidifying central influence. Sacrificing the pawn opens a diagonal for the rook and aims to disrupt White's pawn structure, creating dynamic possibilities. Reclaiming the pawn immediately opens lines and challenges Black's central control, though it weakens White's kingside pawn structure for now. Unleashing the kingside pawn storm, Black aims to disrupt White's central structure and create attacking chances. Opening the f-file now invites sharp tactical play and tests the defenses around White's king. Reclaiming the pawn initiates a complex pawn structure battle, demanding careful piece placement. Unleashing the knight opens a dynamic pawn storm, seeking to pry open lines against Black's uncastled monarch. A bold choice, this queen venture prepares to contest the central files, potentially igniting a sharp tactical sequence. Unleashing the knight to the center creates immediate attacking possibilities and forces Black to react defensively. Unleashing a knight to h5 presents immediate attacking potential, eyeing weak squares around White's king. Disrupting Black's central control and challenging their pawn structure, this move seeks to open lines for White's pieces. Puncturing White's central pawn structure, this knight boldly enters the fray, seeking imbalances. Unleashing the queen to spearhead an assault on Black's king, exploiting the open lines. Opening the queen to the center creates a bold challenge, forcing White to reevaluate their knight's strong central post. Opening the queen forces an endgame where White's doubled pawns might become a liability. Exchanging the bishop resolves immediate tactical threats and opens the d-file for potential pawn advances. Swapping the knight simplifies, opening a path for the rook and preparing to challenge Black's central pawn structure. Shattering the pawn shield offers Black dangerous attacking potential against the exposed monarch. Unleashing the bishop to exploit the exposed kingside, creating immediate tactical threats. Sacrificing the bishop opens lines, and now Black's king seeks sanctuary from the storm. Unleashing a devastating pawn push, White forces Black's king into a perilous spotlight and opens avenues for attack. Unleashing the knight to the advanced outpost creates immediate threats and offers a crucial escape square. This capture seizes control of an open file, initiating a decisive endgame advantage by forcing the knight into a less active square. Shifting the king activates it, preparing to contest central space and support potential pawn pushes. Unleashing a discovered check, White forcibly brings their rook into the attack, aiming to exploit the exposed enemy king. Seeking counterplay, Black redirects the knight to an aggressive outpost, aiming to exploit White's potentially exposed king. Sacrificing the rook here opens the king's escape route and sets up a dangerous discovered attack. Exchanging the bishop surrenders White's queen's file advantage and opens lines for your remaining pieces. Exploiting the open king's diagonal, this rook sacrifice forces a queen trade, simplifying into a winning endgame. Releasing the pinned knight offers a chance to regroup and activate the beleaguered king. Securing the crucial dark squares after the recent exchanges appears paramount. Seeking respite, Black's rook retreats, eyeing a potential escape route and preparing to contest the open g-file. Liberating the bishop creates a precarious outpost, forcing black's king into a vulnerable central position. Reactivating the rook's defensive stance on this open file is a prudent repositioning to guard against further infiltrations. The bishop retreats, a defensive posture aimed at consolidating the queenside and preparing for potential pawn advances.